I'm going to dive in with the first question. Do you think, Mark, that us humans, we're sort of a little bit naive and optimistic in the sense that we tend to underestimate the likelihood of facing a reputational crisis? And if so, do you think we just inherently have a risk aversion, misplaced optimism, or something a little bit more deeply psychological?
Yeah, I think we could go deeper into the optimism bias. I think we have a um, deep inside of us. I think we want to shut out negativity. We don't like hearing bad news, and we overestimate positive outcomes. I believe, and we underestimate the likelihood of experiencing something nasty that is going to, upturn our life. And I think that. I've seen it all really, whether it's family, whether it's corporate, whether it's celebrity, and it's not a nice place to be. So I think it's very difficult to visualize that sort of chaos because, to a certain extent, again, we're all human, and we think that happens to somebody else. Every time somebody who is fairly young falls off the perch, we immediately inquire about his lifestyle and his health. Or was he a smoker? Was he a drinker? Did he take lots of drugs? Did he have? We're looking immediately because we're responding to it to think, "Oh, gosh, that's near my age," or I know that person, and that's when it could be me. In crisis, I think that that people, particularly who have not been thrust into the world of PR, have not been the focal point. Have not had to lead a company, represent sort of corporate results. Perhaps don't think about it, but can get swallowed up by something very, very quickly now, because the biggest problem we face actually is we live in a post-truth, post-fact world. And there's a very clever thing that sort of publications all over the world do now. They nuance, the facts, or the stuff that's clearly hyperbole on a social channel. They'll dig it out and they'll place it in a certain context that you find very difficult to deal with. I mean, if it's a factual untruth or it is a lie, you still have to work pretty hard to persuade the person across the table that that is in fact what it is, because there seems to be more of an emotional response to the news. And one could argue the current president of the United States sort of has rewritten a lot of the rules of power, to maintain power and to bring his own truth to the game. And I'm not here being political at the moment. I'm just fascinated by the way that's reshaping how people communicate, because, one fact that becomes something that leaves his mouth, maybe 2 or 3 days later, there's a complete denial of the fact that that fact has left his mouth 2 days before. So we're in a very different age where legacy media is diminishing in power, where AI is taking over. We're getting more and more half truths being peddled as truths, and I think that what you see is people looking at somebody in public life, whether it's the head of a company, a celebrity, or whoever, and they'll have a thought about that person and what they feel about him without even knowing, or her, or they're him, not knowing anything at all about them, but they're made an opinion because of what they see in front of them, of how they communicate, how they go about their lifestyle, and that all affects the opinion, rather than somebody looking at it through some cold, hard truths. And many people that perhaps I've represented might have been considered to be one thing, but when you get deep inside understanding the human, you might reach a different conclusion, that in fact their public persona no longer represents who they really are. And that can be on the flip side as well. I have represented people, who are on the outside really cool people, incredibly engaging, but that sort of masks a harder truth. about what really motivates them, and the human that they really are when the sort of cameras stop rolling, for want of a better expression.
See, everything you said convinces me we actually should be wired to pay more attention to reputational risk. You said it's because we're human. Yeah. And being human means we're hyper focused on risk all the time, 24/7. Distrust, mistrust, mistruths, malinformation. Yeah. So we should be even more wired to be attentive to reputational risk. But we're not.
Look, I think it's becoming. Look, I think more and more people are looking at it, into a certain extent. The surprising thing is the curveball, the unexpected situation, the human error. I think a lot of what I've dealt with over the years has come from a really stupid human mistake, that catapults you into a place that you're not comfortable with. I think we are talking more about crisis. We are focusing more about the media are more fascinated by crisis. We're seeing public meltdowns. I think if anybody wants to see someone daily destroying what little credibility, if there is any left, just have to go to Kanye West Ye's tweets, to understand, a man who had the world at his feet, probably couldn't even, collect a free coffee on the street. I mean, I think that it is incredible what people will do. So I think hubris is a big challenge, power. And I think the important thing is teams of people around you. Listen, I spent a lot of time in America, 15 years ago, interviewing the last of the Hollywood stuntsters, as they were called, the sort of, the publicists from the studio system. And I met some remarkable people, and all the people I featured in my book are sadly passed now. And I was very lucky, to be ahead of their demise and actually capturing their stories. And one was a very famous American publicist called Jay Bernstein, very big in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He created Farrah Fawcett, and Lee Majors, and Suzanne Summers. He was a very powerful guy. And he said, I never forget the day that I was employed by a Hollywood celebrity. He said, "Hey, Jay, I've got a publicist, but I'm going to pay you more. I want to pay you more, Jay, because I think you will tell me the truth. And I need someone to tell me the truth because I'm living in this world." So he said after 6 months, the then celebrity, who should remain nameless because they're still alive, came back to him and said, "Jay, I'm going to terminate the contract." He said, "Why?" He said, "I realized the publicist who used to tell me what I didn't want to know, I prefer dealing with him. I can't face I can't face the reality," which is, in a sense, a microcosm of a conversation. You've got to be able to deal with tough love. You've got to have a critical friend, and being a critical friend, for people in high places, whether you're sitting alongside them in a boardroom or you're managing their profile. There's a skill set in being a critical friend about how you deliver bad news, because bad news has to be delivered, but there's a
True.
skill set in doing that, and that helps people recognize the enormity of things that they might face, and I think that wisdom comes with age. I think there's some pretty amazing smart people who can work their way around social channels, understand the algorithms, and the sort of tone and inflection of memes, and how to stop memes being created. That's all cool. But sooner or later, when you've got somebody in power who's got there from a career, they want to know the person sitting next to them across the room has got scar tissue. And somebody with me with, as you said, 4 decades in it, I am covered in scar tissue, Doug.
Um, so Mark, you obviously have these incredible clients, very powerful, probably surrounded by a lot of yes people. And you talked just now about the importance of delivering bad news. And what advice would you give to some of our listeners on how to deliver those bad news, to clients and people in positions of power that are surrounded by yes people, and you want to maintain your relational capital with this person, you don't want to get fired, but at the same time you have to deliver that sort of negative news? Is it that sort of age old, give a compliment and then the criticism and sandwich it back with a compliment? What sort of What have you learnt over the years on how to make bad news more palatable?
The first thing is to kill your own ego. If you're going in there swinging your ego as a blunt instrument, you're going to lose a room. I think it is emotional intelligence. First of all, reading the room. The first thing you need to know is, who are the team and who has the loudest voice in that team. If you're joining the room and being brought in, that usually, in my experience, generates internal enemies who do not want you to be in that room because it diminishes their power. So the first thing is to understand what the conditions you work in and go about, how you communicate in that room to get the people in that room to respect you first. And by coming in, playing, I'm the most important person in the room card, you're going to defeat that. Secondly, understand your client. Really understand your client. Spend time with the client and make time with the client. The problem is that sometimes you might be hired for that person and that person has no simpatico with you at all. Someone in the organization has brought you in, she, whatever, does not understand why. So therefore, you've got to earn your stripes, even if you're coming, with a reputation. Every job is different and you have to be humble. Humility is absolutely key. And you're doing a job. And I think that's the important thing. I think that, people in our profession can have a tinge of arrogance, can lack a sort of basic IQ about how they behave. And then once you've sort of understood the person, once you've understood the room, then you can actually find ways of actually getting that truth across. It's using your power well. I think that, if you're going to gain that level of respect, you've got to be incredibly careful how you play your cards, particularly right at the beginning, knowing that, it sounds a bit like Succession here, but knowing that the other people who will be waiting for you to make the wrong move, waiting for you to make a mistake. Now, look, that's not always the occasion. There could be occasion where you're brought in and everybody is sighing a big outpouring of relief because you become the person who's going to take the blame. And if there's any mistakes, it's not me. It's that person we brought in, and we told you so. We didn't need him. So I think it's a game of psychology, but I think being humble, proving yourself, and therefore, when the moment comes to say, "Don't do this, don't do that," and this is a reason, back it up with evidence. Show them, paint them pictures, make them understand the consequences. Look, I've had, I have lost clients by being perceived as being too negative. Mark, you're too negative all the time. I don't see that bad news coming down the line. And it's always refreshing when that person you were close to and the hurt is when you're discarded comes knocking on the door to say, you know what, I really need you back. Now, and then you have the power to, to say yes or no if you come back and what the terms are. But usually it's always very difficult, I think, when you ask questions such as that, very good questions, is actually, that every situation is going to be different. There might be somebody where English is not their first language, and that's the only means I can communicate. My French and Spanish are laughable. So I think that, and particularly culturally, where the problem is coming from, because the way a problem might exist, say, in North America or maybe in Europe, it doesn't really exist when you're talking about the Middle East. You're talking about the Far East. It's a whole different, set of values. And the one place I've never worked on is Japan, and I've had Japanese clients in my consumer days, but that's a whole different ballgame, and I wouldn't go anywhere near that because that's a whole smorgasbord of issues that is difficult to grasp. But I think that I think you just use your experience. I think you've got to take deep breaths. You've got to be very careful in the language you use. You've got to sense check how you use certain expressions, where the client's sort of boundaries are, because the other thing, you're not his friend. You're not their friend. You're not his or her friend. And if you go in there thinking that, it's going to be a very brutal moment when you're cast out. Because let's face it, guys, we all get fired. Sooner or later, we get fired. And that's the other trick I think I've always learned is always be an elegant leaver. You know, don't wander around being, I've got various sort of people, part of, oh, I know where all the bodies are buried, and, they're never going to, I'm going to. What's the point? You were paid a fee, you did a job, you were no longer wanted. Walk away with elegance, with your head held high, and don't think it's all about you. So going back to my original point, kill your own ego.
I love that. And just on the topic of playing nice and reading the room, with crisis, you're often flung in the same room as lawyers, and often lawyers are called in before PRs, and so you sort of arrive at a later stage where the lawyers have already built the relationship with the client. And so tell us some ideas about how to maneuver when you've got a client and you've got a lawyer in place, and how can PRs work more effectively with legal counsel, often when they're the ones brought into the room before the PRs and they've got a head start. And
Well, look, a lot of my work comes from a panel of lawyers that we exchange work. There's some absolutely outstanding legal muscle and reputation in this city. And I know the best people for certain things, whether it's a medical issue, as a court, whatever. And so usually I'm brought in, fairly soon. But not always, and that's a problem. If you come in far too late, you know the stage has been set. Because I think the most simplistic way of describing it is publicists and publicity people, PR man, crisis experts, whatever you want to call them, understand the court of public opinion. Lawyers understand the courtroom.
Court of law. Yeah.
And I think there's a sort of difference, and they're looking at the long tail of maybe a class action. They're looking at it from a pure legal sense. And I'm not saying that lawyers don't have EQ. Of course they do. But there's also a financial dynamic while they're involved, and whether or not lead counsel have brought you in. But the same thing goes in there. I think that it is our aim is to do the same thing, is to sort the mess out, is to protect everybody, and to communicate effectively. But again, lawyers are communicating in a way that maybe 6 months, 18 months, maybe 2 years down the line, what the action has taken, the words that are in public domain, will be used in a court of law. So that's where the nervousness comes from, and they are very nervy. And I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago about someone who defined my solution and the way I was moving forward, and pulled it apart from their point of view of really not understanding the journalist, not understanding the dynamic of the person going for the story. And one had to engage, because if they didn't, the journalist would go rogue, and you'd be spending years taking action on the piece to clean up the facts. So I think it's the best relationship is when a legal mind and a PR mind are simpatico, working on behalf of the situation and dealing with it. Now, look, there is there are examples out there of, I remember the United Airlines, that viral of that person being pulled from the seat, and for 2 days the language of which they dealt with it was very much legal until that had created.
Reaccommodated, wasn't it? We reaccommodated our
You are
passenger.
absolutely right. It was
Yes.
that word, reaccommodated.
Good Lord, that spin.
Yeah, but that was clearly careful language crafted not by a PR guy but a lawyer. You can see the messaging
Yeah.
that it is safety first, and also the question about whether taking on responsibility, denial, apologies, all those can lead, particularly in America, to a sea of lawyers coming at you looking for large compensation. So I get it. I get the safety. I get the questioning and whatever. But again, it's not dissimilar to the previous question and response to that. It's building a relationship. It's not proving to be that your world is the only way, no way otherwise. It is something a lot more subtle, a lot more intuitive than that. But when you work well together, you can sort it out. I've just come to an end of an 18-month piece of work, working completely simpatico with a brilliant head counsel, and also a lawyer, and ourselves. And he challenged me, and we had open conversations about it. And sometimes he sense checked what I wanted to do, and vice versa. But it was a great relationship. We came out of that, and the client is incredibly happy, has moved from what could have been a reputation destroying moment. So and we'll work again together, because I think that's the positive thing to come out of it. I think a lot of relationships that I've got, particularly with law firms, are for the fact we've worked well together when they didn't know me, and they've got to know me, and they can trust me. And you've got to be very, very careful, how you navigate an issue, and how you take the steam out of a situation that can grow and grow into something that is a festering sore that completely debilitates the business.
Okay, reputational risk insurance. I have car insurance. I live in an area where there's a lot of hail. If there's hail that damages the roof of my car, it gets fixed. Damages the roof of my house, I have house insurance. The roof gets replaced or it gets fixed. Reputational risk insurance. Do you guarantee you, how does it work? And do you guarantee you fix my reputation?
Look, there are insurance schemes that exist for big corporate fail, which sucks in PR help. So if you have to recall a product, if you've got a catalytic converter on a car that's gone wrong, and you've got to call back thousands and thousands of cars, there is protection, not only to pay for that, but also to manage the PR. So this is not about corporations. This comes from a number of occasions in the past where people have not paid attention, to the importance of PR, and come back to PR too late. Why? Because my learned friends in the legal profession are usually a little bit more expensive than PR. And so when you're spending a lot of money on law, you want to deal with PR. And sometimes that deal, going for the cheaper option, can result in internal decline. So the insurance actually pays for PR. It doesn't pay for losses, but it immediately. We have an American company called Merrill Herzog that does all the back end in a facilitation. There could be lots of things that draw you into a crisis, even a kidnapping or a family issue. So basically, you have health insurance, you have your car insurance, you've got your art on the wall. You immediately think, I need to ensure that from loss. Well, I would argue personal reputation that's taken years to build, is can be lost in seconds. So you want to be able to to sleep well at night, knowing that if the worst comes to the worst, I can turn to it. the beauty of Pre-Empt is that it gets people thinking. So going back to our original points, well, it's not going to happen to me. One lawyer said to me this week, well, actually, Mark, what you're doing is selling umbrellas in a heat wave, because no one's going to think they've got a problem. And I thought that was quite right. But no, I think a lot of people who are looking at this are also thinking about, what if? What if I make a mistake? You know, what do I do? Because I have seen, unfortunately, in my career, key people in a business being thrown under the bus to protect the greater good of the business. And it's an incredibly lonely place, because the very PRs internally and externally were supporting you evaporate. They're gone. And you're all alone, possibly only with a lawyer. So this is aimed at people, is chief executives. I mean, all sorts of people are taking out academics, sports people, celebrities, yes, CEOs, who perhaps have got, issues of behavior 20, 30 years ago that they might have to defend, people who know that they make a mistake. And it allows us to have conversations with those people up front to make them aware. And I guess it's a bit like, you take out insurance on your house and someone wanders around and say, are your alarms working properly? Have you got fire alarms? Have you got carbon monoxide detectors? Are you in a vulnerable route? Is there enough covering and security for your kids going to school? So it allows you to ask those questions, and it prepares people for the worst case scenario. I've had this idea for many years. I guess I was representing a very major insurance business, and I put it to them, and the reaction was, it's too niche. I tried a few more and really couldn't get anybody to buy into it. And it was one of those sort of moments where I bumped into a very high-profile journalist who had a friend who was a expert in insurance, and he said, meet my man Derek here. He's got a great idea. And when he told me what it was, I said, you never do it, Derek. You'll never find someone to go for it. And he said, well, if I do, can we work together on it? I said, look, I'll be all over it. So that took about 3 years, 2 years, 2 years. We found an amazing insurer, Samfire, who wanted to Derek McLeod from Reputational built the program in terms of what it would cover, what it wouldn't, how it would match in, and it's being called, in the insurance business, one of the most innovative insurance products of a generation. So we shall see, and I'm very excited by it. It's only about 2 or 3 months old at the moment, but we've had some remarkable conversations, some difficult conversations with people too, because NDA'd up, we have seen what is lurking around for certain people, and it's quite shocking occasionally, of the fear that individuals face that this thing could actually rear up and destroy them, and not just them but their families, because that's what it's all about. Crisis is never quite what you think it is. Even in a height of a corporate thing, you've got to think of friends, families, networks, and of course nearest and dearest, who get sucked into this massive hurricane, and you lose all sense of who you are, and it's horrible, and I've seen it too many occasions, and but I guess that's why I go there, because I've seen a lot of it.
Mark, do you think that there is a solid awareness in boardrooms that reputation is an asset? I mean, an asset that appears on balance sheets. When you still look at boards, you don't always see comms people on the board. I mean, you would see marketing people. So the fact that we haven't quite made it as an industry on boards, do you think that has an impact upon the fact that perhaps reputation isn't valued as an asset? Or do you think there's an increasing awareness because of all of the crisis that's happening, and people, and the fact that they're so high profile, and social media's brought an immediacy to crisis, and that sort of has made people realize in the boardroom that actually we do need to look at reputation as an asset?
Look, I think it's changing. I think I've seen, a lot of change over the last 5 years. I'm seeing more and more, sort of people either from big cheesy corporate PRs or even internal PRs moving into the boardroom. I think there are some very switched on companies, particularly in tech, particularly around the sort of social space. That do see it and do want at the heart of the board. I've seen some of the very big publicly listed entertainment businesses having PR people on the board. So I think it's changing. I think the perhaps the more contemporary of institutions see it. I think it's slightly slower for the more institutionalized sort of businesses who, legacy businesses are sort of trundling on in the way that they've done it. And, I think there's a lot of really good people who have sold agencies, who've semi retired or whatever, who are being asked to come in as non executives with that very with that very intention to be able to help them. I think that we're seeing it in oil and gas in particular. I think those who face the steepest mountains reputationally to come. But you're right. Some people see reputation as a profound and tangible asset. Others really see the bottom line and the progress to that bottom line to it. I saw a brilliant thing from Lewis PR last week. Chris Lewis showed me his new crisis room he's created, which is incredible sort of training software where he's using AI to help chief executives be better communicators and actually link that to the way statements or why when they're facing extreme tests, those emotions that show in their face can actually affect the share price. Some people might say it's a bit of voodoo, but I was very impressed by the investment he's put in it. So
Mhm.
I think that more and more companies are seeing that the sort of sword of Damocles is swinging over them daily, and they better have someone who can help them keep it swinging rather than landing.
I
And the
love
insurance.
that Pandora's box of reading facial expressions using AI. That's a little bit of
I
gold that
think
we
that's
could
where it's
spin an
going, Doug.
episode from.
I think anybody who is not looking at AI as a tool in PR are going to be
Yeah.
left behind.
Oh, yeah.
Simple as that. Whether
Yeah.
it's down to basic tasks, whether it's down to research, the generative AI models are just going to get better and better and better and better. And I think that get on board of it not as a bunch of Luddites, smashing the machinery up there, thinking, what can it do? And I think it will have a profound effect on employment. That's for sure. But I think for every job it takes away, it should increase other areas for people to work in. So we don't see many professions that existed 10, 15, 20 years ago. I remember, talking about, how explain to somebody how cutting agencies worked. And, it was like talking about, flint edge tools to work in masonry, and then I went in to see someone who said, look, I'm not going to send any emails anymore. I'm going to go back to posting letters, and it's a
Cool.
fashion based brand. And
Yeah.
they had done that very, very successfully by targeting some of the big voices in fashion by sending them a physical letter. And they had a 90% response, where previously a similar launch, they used an email, they had a 5% response. So I think that it's incredible that many of the analog ways, do have impact, and we're seeing more and more people leaving phones at the door, particularly in experiences, not allowing people to photograph it. Some great technology. You can actually put the phone in a wallet with a code on, and you can have it released after the show and stuff like this. I think there is a tinge towards analog, because I don't think digital quite is ubiquitous. And that's a part AI is going to play to improve all that. I think AI can be used as an improvement tool, and particularly in terms of the tools that we use in terms of prediction. We're looking all the time with a tool that we partly own, that indicates through AI, referencing, should we say, past statements and how hypocrisy now is leaking in. You have one position 5 years ago, and now you represent another position. That's a red flag, and should be a red flag, because people forget what they say.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for your time today, Mark.
It's been great speaking to you, Franz. Thanks for doing it, and Doug, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.